from the one who saves. Amen. So Amos is upset, as we saw in the first reading. He seems to be describing the beautiful people, I want to say, of his day. Those with so much excess, so much wealth, and so much time to simply enjoy all they have accumulated. But most of his concern really isn't the wealth itself, but the way people think about the world around them once they've kind of obtained their wealth. Luxury is a problem when it comes right at the expense of somebody else. Right? So a culture of indifference for Amos has been created in Israel. We often find corporate prophets in our own day that can come at the expense of another part of a population. Or prophets that don't take into account the impact to people in another part of a world. There seems to be this kind of sense of indifference in this corporate world. Now, having said that, even to my experience in working in that world, those who run corporations don't really sit around and think of ways to create profits at the expense of the poor. This is not what they do. They do put a priority on profits, right? And they downplay consequences to other people or to the environment in which they operate. That's not unusual. This seems to be the world that really Amos is speaking to. The people of Israel have been blessed in many ways, but they've forgotten how to care for the poor in their country. Amos speaks to those who lounge on their couches, who sing idle songs, who drink wine from bowls. I don't know how you picture that. I picture this big bowl and it washes all over them. I don't know. They anoint themselves, right? But they do not grieve the plight of the poor. They don't even seem to be trying. So sometimes it's hard to make this kind of personal comparison to our own time. I mean, we see the corporate indifference, but we also see a lot of good that's being done. It's not that we can't find injustice in the world around us, but we can find so many different organizations, right, and efforts that reach out to help. So I'm always amazed how often I see here in Pueblo, but really more in my travels around Colorado and almost every major city, with signs on street corners, somebody with a sign on a street corner describing a hardship and wanting money. So, which is something Aiden was talking about a little bit earlier. We have so many organizations that try to help. Los Pobres, the Faith Leaders in Action here. Lutheran Social Services is very active with that. Food pantries, even mobile food pantries that work around the state. Homeless shelters, which focus on housing first. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Churches reaching out to support ministry in other churches or nonprofits. And I think Jill, I asked her about that earlier. She has like this whole host of information in the office, right, about Pueblo groups serving the community. Yet we still find people looking for money on a street corner. For the longest time, I would reach in, I'd roll my window down, reach in and pull out a couple dollars and give it to them. But then it became apparent that much of that money was going to feed something other than their body, kind of, particularly in my time in Anchorage, there was enormous issues with really organizations that organized these people, and they were really feeding an addiction. So not to be judgmental about this, but I had an opportunity to switch and start using wood nickels. Now, have you ever seen those before? Those little wooden nickels? Do they have them here in Pueblo? I don't think so. I haven't seen them. They have these, some communities use them to avoid some of these problems with handing out cash. So in Anchorage, they had a wood nickel that was good for one day supply of food, and they were sponsored by the Catholic Social Services. So each wooden nickel had a value, this one day of food, and the address for Catholic social services. And it also had the outbound bus routes from downtown Anchorage to get to the Catholic social services. And the transit authority honored those wooden nickels and gave them a ride, right? So at the site when they got there was a food pantry, a church. There were some other social services for homeless, for special needs assistance. I think the Catholic Church also had pregnancy assistance and stuff. So they had a lot of different services that were being offered. So instead of giving money to somebody who was panhandling on a street corner, I would give them one of these wooden nickels or a couple of them, and then let them know that it was for food, right? That was the whole idea. I felt like I was helping to bridge this gap between those of us that have so much and those that have so little. Yet, I have absolutely no idea if those wooden nickels were ever cashed in. I have no idea if the person ever made it to Catholic Social Services. And when I think about it, I don't know if I really bridged that gap at all. Maybe the wooden nickels really aren't that big of a deal. Amos might say our society is taking the right step, but the chasm between the haves and the have-not is so enormous in this world. Jesus also speaks to this morning. He tells the Pharisees and the disciples the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. It's tragic that nobody considers helping Lazarus. It seems odd that someone would simply walk past by, although I'm sure we've all seen someone like the man on our bulletin cover, right? We've seen him in Pueblo. We've seen him probably in every community we've been in that we've visited. But then the tables are turned when both men die. The rich man now begs for a single drop of water, but there's no relief available. A large chasm separates the two. Even in the midst of what we would see as punishment, the rich man still expects Abraham to send Lazarus to warn his brothers. The rich man's way of thinking blinds him to the humanity in Lazarus. If he can't see beyond his earthly plight, how can he ever see who Lazarus could have been had his circumstances been different? It appears that the chasm that separates them now was really present right when they were alive on earth. Maybe that's how the chasm became so fixed. It was deemed that way by the rich man during his life. Yet, I can't emphasize this enough. This parable isn't about fixing Lazarus. It may be about simply reducing the chasm, right, that separates all of us from those who have less, the people like Lazarus in our world. So maybe the idea is instead of the chasm being so huge that we just narrow it down along the way, it may be about seeing humanity in a person laying on the side of the street. It may be about taking the time to talk to them, to hear their story, to give them a sense of knowing that others are interested in who they are. Or it may be about getting them through the next day, right? In the hopes that others will get them to a place of peace. Find a place of comfort. Many years ago, I was living in Anchorage, and this is before I entered ministry. I was asked to stop on my way to church by my pastor to pick up a man at the VA homeless center. His name was Tommy. Tommy had been homeless and living on the streets for over 20 years. He was a veteran and had entered this very strict program that the VA had to end his homelessness and then re-enter society. And the program focused on addressing everything from addiction issues to developing skills for employment and placing their graduates in transitional housing, right? So the chasm between Tommy's life and mine, as I was working for an oil and gas company then, the chasm between us was huge. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And so it was that I would pick up Tommy every Sunday morning, which really meant I checked him out, I took him to church, and then gave him a ride back to the VA center and checked him back in. On special occasions, I would put in a request for additional time, and we would go have a bite to eat after worship. Along the way, I got to know Tommy a little bit. He loved to play the guitar and sing. He had a beautiful voice. He had no addiction issues. He didn't drink and he didn't do drugs. And he spoke frequently just about the freedom he felt living on the streets. No obligations to tie him down. Nobody else's expectations to meet. And I kind of accepted, right, the chasm between us. I kind of thought, well, it's okay. This went on for several months, and then Tommy became very ill. I got a call from him, and he had been taken to the hospital. He was going to have bypass surgery. He turned out that he had several blockages, and so he needed this open heart surgery. He called me because he had nobody else to call. I went to the hospital to see him immediately. And I have to tell you, this is a time of my life where I would begin thinking of reasons to get out of the hospital as soon as I put my foot in. You know, have you ever experienced that? It's like, oh, I really don't want to be here. So I sat with Tommy for a couple of hours the night before his surgery. He was worried about living through the procedure. Nothing unusual about that. I found out how really little that I knew about him. He had 3 girls and was divorced. His parents were both college professors, and he had a college education. He never seemed to be able to stay connected with people. The chasm closed, and I no longer accepted it as being okay. Once he left and began living on the streets, he never tried to contact anyone. He had been missing for over 20 years. He gave me names of his children and his parents in case something horrible happened during the surgery. I saw his fear. I saw his regrets and the love he had for people that he had abandoned. His humanity really showed through. Now, Tommy did well with that surgery, and he returned to the VA center to complete his program. He re-entered life in a small apartment that he shared with 2 other people. He was adapting. He used a bicycle for transportation. In Anchorage, he was riding a bicycle. It wouldn't last long. He wasn't able to get the job that he hoped for. Then, one Sunday, Tommy's bike wasn't at church. He didn't show up. He was supposed to play the guitar and sing, which made it very strange that he wasn't there. And I later found out that he had borrowed the guitar and he had to return it to a young woman who was going off to college. He was too embarrassed to tell anybody. Within a week, he had left the apartment and he was back on the street. A few years later, a woman from my church ran into him as she volunteered at the local soup kitchen. He was fine, feeling at home again on the streets. For a few months, the chasm between Tommy and the world had a chance to kind of narrow. He carried with him experiences and new relationships. He showed great appreciation for all the people who reached out to help him. He simply couldn't adjust to the world that we so take for granted. The point wasn't to fix Tommy. The point was to know him, to love him, to give him a sense of dignity, a sense of place in a community, even if it's just for a short window of time, to let him know that people there cared. All of this happened because Tommy asked for a ride to church, and someone gave him a lift. Maybe those wooden nickels aren't so bad after all. Maybe a trip through one of our social services will offer someone else a chance for an opportunity like Tommy's. It may not be with the VA, but it may be through another assistance program for the homeless. It may be simply sitting and finding someone to listen to their story. Jesus' parable is all about closing this chasm between the haves and the have-nots. It may not be like, flipping a light switch. Then again, it may happen with one small act of kindness followed by another. What chasm might you close as you walk through life? And that is ministry we can all engage in. Amen.